pals, I'm here today to do some more reading recommendations. These are my favourite videos to film and I've had such fun putting together this list because I love all these books. I had a blast reading these. Like, when I look at my bookshelves and think about the books I just completely loved reading, I would view these and then like Robin Hobb's fantasy books, because I feel like for whatever reason I find fantasy and these type of books really compulsively readable but also fully immersive. I completely believe in the world the author has built, and also when I'm not reading I'm thinking about, oh, what could that mystery be? What could that secret mean? Can I predict this? Can I figure this out? And I love that about a book. So I've been trying to think for a while about the best way to describe these books, and the best I could come up with is kind of like dark and twisty literary thriller, but I don't think that really gets across precisely what I mean. And so I often watch author interviews after I've really loved a book, and last year I read Carla by Colin Walsh and I really loved that book, and I will be talking about it in a moment. And I watched a very short interview he did where he described it like this. Carla is a novel in the tradition of books like The Secret History of Donna Tartt or Emma Cline's The Girls, in that it aims to marry the emotional and psychological complexity of literary fiction with the propulsive, page-turning momentum of a thriller. And yeah, like I said, I couldn't have put that about myself. I think I love watching like mystery thriller things on TV and in film, but as a reader, I really like, character development, a fairly slow pace, and really beautiful writing, and I don't tend to find that as much in the kind of mystery or thriller genre. So this kind of blend of literary fiction and that genre really works for me. So I think if you've read like one or more than that of these books, but not the others, then I think you're likely to enjoy the others too, because they all have that kind of similar feel to them, and I just adored them. So let's get cracking. So the first book is, of course, Carla by Colin Walsh. This is a debut novel that came out in 2023, and I listened to this on audio. I would highly recommend the audio. It is brilliantly narrated by 3 voice actors, and that is because this novel is told from 3 perspectives. It opens in the present day when 3 friends meet again in a seaside town in Ireland after not seeing each other for many years. They were part of a friendship group of 6 teenagers in 2003, and they were all kind of obsessed with each other, forever in one another's orbit. And at the centre of that friendship group was Carla, and this sort of magnetic young woman. And towards the end of 2003, she went missing and was never found. And in the present day, as these 3 characters sort of meet again for different reasons, the remains of a body are found locally, and there is suspicions that this body could be Carla. Very soon after that, 2 local girls go missing, and it kind of amps up the tension and makes these 3 characters have to start questioning their complicity in Carla's disappearance, start questioning whether they withheld anything from the police that could have been useful in finding Carla sooner. And yeah, just sort of questioning everybody around them. You can't really trust anyone. And so you get these 3 perspectives both in the present day but also in 2003, and you see everything sort of build up to that moment in the past when Carla disappeared, and everything build up to this moment in the present when things are perhaps going to be uncovered. And it is spectacular. It gets quite like scary at points. There is some violence in this book, and something I know a lot of people really didn't like about this book is that there is a scene of cruelty to animals. There's a scene of dog fighting, which isn't a very long scene, but is part of the narrative. I thought this was so intelligently written, beautifully written. Like, the detail is spectacular. I could just highlight sections of this book that were really, really evocative and really captured what it's like to be a teenager and the feelings you have about these really intense friendships. I can't wait to see what this author writes in the future. And the next one is Ohio by Stephen Markley. I chose to talk about this one here because I think it has similarities with Carla in that this is about 4 high school friends converging as adults on their small town in Ohio on a sweltering summer night in 2013. The premise of this one is that each of them has different reasons for being back there, some of which are quite suspicious. And throughout this one night, they bump into one another and other people who they went to high school with. And throughout the night, things start to unfold and are revealed about an event that happened when they were teenagers. And there's this, along with Carla, this kind of double mystery being unfolded. The one being what happened back when they were teenagers, who did what, who's hiding what, who knows, who doesn't. And the other being what are the repercussions of that going to be in the present. So this book does get very tense towards the end. My heart was racing when I was reading this book. And like I said, it deals with some difficult content. Also, this book is just fantastic in terms of like character development. So you get segments with each of the characters and you sort of revisit them throughout the night. And the way he writes, like one of the characters in particular is a veteran, and the way he writes from his perspective, like he just has each of their voices completely down. They feel like such fully realised people, and I just loved spending time with these people. And I think this book is also filled with so much commentary about America, about class and poverty and sexism and gender dynamics and capitalism and what it's like to live in a place like Ohio, in a small town where you feel like no one's ever going to escape. And I just absolutely, like, this book took my breath away. I am so glad I got to experience it. The next one is Penance by Eliza Clark. I completely inhaled this book. I nearly read through this whole book in one sitting, but then it got to quite late at night and I got to a point in the book that's quite kind of horrible. So like, along with Ohio, this one is probably the most upsetting book to read. Definitely look up trigger warnings. And I was like, I'm going to stop reading this now because I don't want nightmares tonight. And then I finished it as soon as I got up in the morning. And yeah, I would like reread this again in a heartbeat because, like I said, I just inhaled it and I found this so compulsively readable. So the premise of this one is that in 2006, a 16-year-old girl in a northern seaside town in England was brutally murdered by three of her teenage schoolmates, three girls. And it sort of was very quickly off front page news because other stuff happened in the UK and it was just never really discussed again. In the present day, there's this true crime author called Alex C. Corelli, and his career's not doing great. He needs a new book to release that's about a crime that hasn't been spoken about to death on all these new true crime podcasts, and he comes across this crime. And this book is the true crime non-fiction book that he wrote. So it's kind of like metafiction in that you're reading it as though Eliza Clark didn't write it and Alex C. Corelli did. So this book kind of does two things. It tells the story of what happened in this seaside town that, allowed three teenage girls to feel like that was something they wanted or needed to do, to brutally kill this other girl. And you really get into all their heads and yeah, look at all this horrible stuff. This book's a really brilliant look at, I think, how cruel teenage girls can be to one another. I went through a kind of horrible 2-year period when I was sort of pre-teen, where I was bullied quite horrifically by one girl at school, and this I found quite difficult in terms of being reminded of how it felt to be in those moments. So I think she really captured that, and also capturing what it's like to be picked on or to be isolated at school with social media, with that being a thing, so you can kind of also feel isolated within your own home because you're not online talking to everybody. And there's some real deep dives in this book about internet culture and the effect that can have on teenagers, and I thought that was really brilliantly handled. But then on top of all of that, there's this other discussion about how much of what we're being told is true, how much is Alex C. Corelli twisting the narrative to make it more entertaining. How ethical is this book? When he tells us that he got this interview for an ethical source, did he? Did all these people agree to be interviewed? How has he got hold of this source information? And so it has this kind of additional layer that adds some real interest to the book that perhaps didn't go quite as far as I wanted it to do, but that's like my only very slight criticism of this book. I really enjoyed it, but like I said, it does have quite a lot of upsetting content, so I would definitely look into the trigger warnings for this one. And then we have Shelter by Jung Yun. I've just realised I seem to have front loaded this video with the most sort of triggering brutal books, so yes, there we go. So I actually reread this one this year. This came out in 2016, and I read it on a train journey home the day I bought it in London and just could not stop reading. And then yeah, reread it this year, enjoyed it just as much, if not more. I just really admire her as a writer. The premise of this is that we're following this Korean-American man who lives with his wife and young son, and he's really struggling because they have really been affected by like the credit crisis in the US, and they are thinking they may have to remortgage their house or even sell it because it may be worth less than like they ever paid for it. At the same time, his parents are super wealthy. They live in this really luxury neighbourhood. They have loads of spare cash, but our protagonist doesn't want to ask for any money off them because he has a really volatile relationship with them, and he also feels an immense sense of pride and doesn't want them to know about this dire financial situation he's in. As the book opens, they have a realtor round to value their house, and then a naked woman stumbles into their garden covered in blood, and that woman is Kyung's mother. So you quickly realise that a home invasion has happened at Kyung's parents' house, and from there you find out not only more details about the home invasion, which is horrible, you also find out details about why Kyung has such a difficult relationship with his parents. I found this book really interesting, particularly on a reread, because Kyung's not very likeable. He makes decisions in the book but seem really stupid and just really unkind towards his wife. But when you read it through the lens of understanding this trauma he has from his childhood, it makes complete sense that he wouldn't have the capacity to emotionally deal with the situation he finds himself in. And that situation is that while his parents are recovering, they have to live with him. And so he's forced into this really close environment with them, and also has even more financial strain put on him because of that. This book is possibly one of the plottiest books I have on the list, but I don't want you to think when I say that means this book isn't really intelligently crafted and really thoughtful. I think she's exploring some really interesting themes about the immigrant experience, about the expectations of parents on immigrant children, and also about class and about sort of gender dynamics, especially like traditional gender roles within families. I think this author is an excellent writer. I've read her new novel and also think that's really brilliantly written, and I would highly recommend this one. Then we have Burnam Wood by Eleanor Catton. I always find this book quite difficult to explain, so bear with me. There's this guerrilla gardening group in New Zealand who've been running for 5 years, and they basically use ignored land that is privately owned to grow food crops and then to provide these to people who can't afford to purchase their own food. And they're starting to go under, things aren't really working, they're not going where they thought they would go, just as this landslide happens that blocks off a large tract of arable land. And one of the co-founders of Burnam Wood, this guerrilla gardening group, Mira, decides to illegally use this land with the group. However, things get more complicated. When she is there, sort of wrecking the land, she runs into this American billionaire who just rocks up in his private helicopter. And he says, I actually own this land. I'm building like an end-time bunker here, but I'm interested in what you do, so I'll give you this large chunk of money and you can use that to farm this land. This results in lots of really intense discussions between the people who run Burnam Wood, because ethically they don't agree with taking money off somebody who sort of represents everything about the world that they hate and is kind of somebody who represents capitalism in all its horrible forms. And so what follows is a book that is from multiple perspectives. You get Mira's perspective, you get the billionaire's perspective, you get the perspective of a married couple who own a large portion of the land where this book takes place. You also get the perspective of Shelley, who is the person who actually runs Burnam Wood. She makes everything actually happen. And at the start of the book, she's considering leaving before they get this area of land. And the last perspective is Tony. Tony is somebody who has been gone for many years. He was one of the original co-founders of Burnam Wood, but he has returned and he really doesn't agree with them taking this money from the billionaire. And so that all sounds like it could be kind of boring. Now, there was a mixed response to this book. I think this is one of the most intelligently written books I've ever read. I think if you enjoy the way Stephen Markley writes, there's a chance you might also enjoy this. I don't think Eleanor Catton is as verbose in her descriptions, that I think the kind of intellectual discussions that take place between characters is reminiscent of Stephen Markley's writing. And as with Stephen Markley's writing, Eleanor Catton is clearly interested in lots of themes that she balances really well throughout the book. And yeah, I just loved the ride of this. I not only thought it was super intelligent and like perfectly written, like there wasn't a word out of place in my opinion, but also it was so thrilling. Like, this is another book that towards the end my heart was racing. I couldn't believe where this book was going, and it felt like kind of Tarantino-esque towards the end. Like, I was shocked and I had to like flick back and like reread pages to make sure I'd like followed the action properly. It was crazy and I thought it was absolutely fantastic. Now the next two I'm putting together because they have kind of similar plots. They read like entirely different books. These books would have been written around the same time, so there's no way that they're like either of these authors copied the other, so I think it's just one of those really random things. But I read this one first, and then when I heard about the other one I was like, I have to read that as well because, you know, I loved this first one so much and they sound similar. So the first one is I Have Some Questions for You by Rebecca Mackay. I still need to read more books from this author because I really enjoyed this one. The premise of this is that we are following this woman called Bodhi, who is a professional podcaster, and she is invited back to her New England boarding school that she attended as a teenager to teach some classes on podcast production. When she goes back to this boarding school, she starts to think about the murder of one of her classmates at the time she was attending the boarding school, and sort of starts to think over it all again and sort of relook into the case. The task she gives her student is to create a podcast mini-series, and one of them decides she wants to investigate this murder and do like a true crime podcast about it. And Bodhi kind of guiltily encourages her in this because at the heart of this novel there's a question of who has a right to tell a story. Bodhi feels like, okay, so yes, I did attend the school at the time this happened, but I wasn't like a close friend of the victim, and so it's not really my story to tell, like it should be down to the close friends and family members. But then this student feels like she has the right to tell it, even though she never even knew the girl who was murdered and didn't attend the school at the same time as her. So it's a kind of really interesting look at that throughout the novel. And another thing that is at the heart of this novel is that the person who was accused was the only person of colour on the campus. He was one of the sports instructors and he was a young black man and he was convicted of the murder. And Bodhi doesn't believe he did it. She believes the investigation was kind of bungled, and she starts to question whether she had a part to play in that and whether there was kind of implicit bias even in someone like herself who was kind of a young student. And so this book again takes place in the present day, and then also goes back to the past when Bodhi was at school and the investigation was happening. In the present, another kind of interesting element of this is that Bodhi is split from her husband, but they're not yet divorced, and he is accused of something sort of as part of the Me Too movement, and she comes under question when he is accused, kind of wrongfully comes under question, because it's like this man does something wrong and then the closest woman attached to him gets the shit for it, which is very interesting. And I really enjoyed this one. I don't think this is like the best written of all of them. I think there was a couple of sentences throughout the book where I didn't love the writing style, but I found it compulsively readable and I found it super fun, like to try and figure out what happened. I made a lot of guesses. We read this as part of my Patreon book club, and I made lots of incorrect guesses with this one, so it was a real joy to read. And the next one is The Damages by Genevieve Scott. So the premise of this one is that in 1997, Roz was attending Regis University. I'm not quite sure how you say it. And there was a big snowstorm that kind of shut the university down for quite a few days. And during this snowstorm, her roommate went missing. She disappeared. And Roz was one of the people questioned when this happened. And in the present day, Roz's husband, who she's also kind of split up from but not divorced, is accused of a sexual assault. And she has to start to battle with whether she thinks he did it and what that means for their young son. At the same time as she gets contacted by a journalist who says, I am re-examining like what happened to your roommate and like what happened to everybody involved and how the investigation sort of happened. And so it forces Roz again to look back at her own complicity. I think this book does that even more than I have some questions for you, because what's really interesting about this book is that Roz is a kind of, I don't know if I'd say unlikable, but kind of unknowable character, in that when she gets to university, she decides that she wants to be cool. And so what she does is she sort of attaches herself to people who she views as cool, and she just tries to mimic them. So she doesn't appear to have any of her own personality. And so she sort of goes through her life like that. And even in the sections in the present day, which take place during lockdown, and she's living in this lakeside house with her son and her mother, you still don't really get a sense as to who she is and what she actually likes. And it's really interesting to see that type of personality continue into adulthood. I really enjoyed seeing how that would play out and how she kind of moved through life and the thoughts that went through her head with every interaction with another person. And so she was actually quite cruel to her roommate, who was a really lovely girl, because she didn't view her as cool, and so she didn't give her any kind of social cachet, and so she just kind of ignored her. And so she did kind of do things that may have led to the disappearance and to the investigation not going like it should have done. And it's a really interesting examination of that. And in the present day, it becomes a question of whether you trust your own memory, whether you have kind of reconstructed events over the years due to guilt, or due to you wanting to sort of remove any responsibility from yourself. And so I think this book is a really excellent examination of those themes. Another thing this book does really well is it looks at the 90s and looks at the way we discussed sexual freedom in the 90s, and it's a really uncomfortable read as a person in the present day after the Me Too movement, because a lot of the shit that happens in this book in the 90s would be completely frowned upon now, but would have just been completely acceptable then, and it's kind of cringe and horrible to read that. And again, I just found this one so readable, and I just couldn't wait to finish this one. Now, you may have noticed that I haven't included any Donna Tartt books on this list, and in part that's because it just feels kind of obvious. Like, Donna Tartt is the queen at writing these kind of dark and twisty literary thrillers, and a lot of books get compared to Donna Tartt's books, both in theme and in writing style, and most of the time I think those comparisons are just wrong. But one book I read a few years ago that I really did think was a fair comparison to Donna Tartt in terms of her writing style and the theme she's interested in was White Ivy by Susie Yang. So I just thought this book was fantastic, and the writing style was amazing and very reminiscent for me of Donna Tartt's writing. The premise of this is that there's two timelines. One of those timelines is a coming of age narrative, which I love. And that coming of age narrative follows Ivy Lin, who is the child of working class Chinese immigrants. And she gets a place at an elite private school because her father is the caretaker there, so she gets to go kind of on scholarship. And in doing that, she's surrounded by people from like a different social sphere to her. And there's this one boy at the school who kind of represents the all-American dream. He's blonde hair, blue-eyed, kind of golden-skinned, super wealthy, also really nice. And he starts to kind of epitomise to her, the American dream, the goal, which to her is to completely assimilate and to kind of be one of these people and to not be seen as kind of linked to her family in any way. And as a young child, her grandmother teaches her to steal. And so she gets this really good skill at kind of blending in to her surroundings and acting to sort of imitate the people around her so as to go unnoticed. And then we have this section in the present day where years later, as an adult, she bumps into this boy she was obsessed with in school. And she begins a relationship with him, and he's like super, super rich. She also bumps into another friend she had who did not attend her school and was from a working class background himself. And he kind of was the only person who knew the real Ivy. And so in the present day, there's this push and pull between these two men, between what they represent for Ivy. One of them representing this life she's always wanted, where she can be rich and sort of blend in, but where she is constantly spoken to with contempt because of her race. Or this life where she'll never lift herself out of her background, but she will be seen for who she is and be recognised and not have to act or put on kind of any front. And I guess Ivy's kind of unlikable because she is entirely acting throughout the whole book, and she makes some quite crazy decisions. But I was really rooting for her throughout because, yeah, I don't know, I just really got on board with her. And like I said, the writing style is very reminiscent of Donna Tartt in that it's, the way I would describe this writing is kind of rich and luscious. And those are the words I think of when I think about Donna Tartt's writing. There's lots of descriptions of the clothes they wear, of the decor of a room, of the food they eat. And those descriptions allow you to understand the sort of class of people you're moving through. So what I think this book really offers is it discusses all the themes that Donna Tartt discusses in her books, but with the added brilliance of discussing what it is like for a person of colour and a child of immigrants in these situations, and I just found that absolutely brilliant. This next one is Tell Me What I Am by Una Mannion. This is her second book, and I really enjoy her first book as well, and would perhaps include it on this list as well, but I've spoken about this one less. So this is perhaps one of the quieter books on the list, and one of the ones where there is a mystery at the heart of it, but it isn't quite as epic or hard to pick apart. But what I think this book did brilliantly is, one, I just really enjoy this author's writing style. I feel really kind of at ease and comfortable when I read her books. And I think what she does brilliantly in this book is examine coercive control and how terrifying that can be, and how difficult it can be to get somebody out of a situation like that, and how if you kind of try to save them, they can resist being saved because the person controlling them is telling them they don't need to be. And I think this book is quite terrifying in that regard. So the premise of this is it's set across 14 years from two viewpoint characters. We follow Nessa, whose sister disappeared years ago, and she was believed to be a runaway, but she never believed that because her sister absolutely adored her daughter Ruby and was trying to leave her very violent partner. And so Nessa has always been suspicious of this ex and has always thought that he had something to do with her sister's disappearance, and she in fact believed that her sister was murdered by him. And then we also follow this niece, Ruby, as she grows up in a completely different part of the US and has no connection with her mother's family, and just believes, is told by her father and his mother that her mother left her and couldn't be bothered to raise her. And so you're following these two perspectives. One is Nessa's perspective in the past, where you get to see what actually happened, and one is Ruby's perspective as she grows up and as she starts to resist her father's control. They live completely off the grid. She doesn't go to school, she doesn't receive letters, and he is, really, really controlling, super domineering. And so you start to see as she starts to push the boundaries of that control, and as in doing so, suspicions are raised. This book is very tense because at the heart of both these narratives is this really violent, controlling and suspicious man. And so you're constantly in fear thinking, God, Ruby, don't do that because I don't know what he's going to do if you do. And yeah, it's just, like I said, an excellent examination of what it's like to live with one of these people, what it's like for them to control everything about your life. And I think the way this unfolds was really enjoyable, and I just really enjoy her writing style, so I'd highly recommend this one. And last, we have a new release, which was my most anticipated pre-order of 2024. That is from one of my favourite authors, and it was absolutely brilliant and I loved it. And so I will be doing a long form review video on this one, but I just wanted to get this video up because I was really excited to talk about all of these books. And that book is The God of the Woods by Liz Moore. And the reason I saved this book for this point in the video is because I don't know what it is, but something about Una Mannion's writing and Liz Moore's writing to me is kind of familiar. I think if you enjoy one of these authors' books, it's likely you'll enjoy the other one. So I thought I would sort of pair them together at the end. This book is like truly epic in scope, and yeah, like I read the last 50 pages of this a few days ago and my heart was racing. Like I could actually feel my heart racing for the last 50 pages. I felt really tense. And this book is also a really brilliant examination of power and control, like the previous book. The premise of this book is that in 1975, a young girl goes missing at a summer camp in the Adirondacks. But she is not just any young girl, she is the 13-year-old daughter of the Van Laar family who actually own this summer camp and the whole preserve that surrounds this summer camp. To make things even more suspicious, 14 years earlier, their young son Bear also went missing and was never found. So now there are suspicions on the family about why both of their children went missing, and also crucially, why the search for Bear started so late after he disappeared and was ended so early by the family. And so this book has multiple perspectives, both of the family members themselves, of an investigating police officer, and also told from the perspective of some of the other campers and a lot of the people in the area, the working class people who were employed by the Van Laar family. This book was, amazing because there's these two mysteries that are kind of connected and there's all these suspicions on this family. This book is an excellent examination of privilege and the misuse of privilege. So it is fascinating and it is a wild ride. Like, out of all these books, this one the most makes me think of Ohio, because it feels like she's built this entire world. You know, this is all set in this heavily wooded area in the Adirondacks on this summer camp. So you're either filled with like all the kind of beautiful nature writing, or you're back at the Van Laar house on this estate where all these horrible rich people are who kind of all gossip about one another and are all really unkind, and you kind of feel trapped by both these environments. And I just absolutely loved it, and it was a wild ride. And I think this is probably the most intelligently plotted of all of these books. Like, I had about 20 wrong guesses with this one. Like, yeah, it was just brilliantly plotted and I couldn't figure out what the hell was going on, and I loved that. So yeah, that's the last book I wanted to talk about. I would love to know how many of these books you've read. I would also love to know if you have any recommendations for books I didn't include in the video. Always want more books to read like this. And I'd also love to know if you are planning to pick up any of these books based on my recommendations. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.